Hey folks, how you doing?
Hi Benji. All good here. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Running a little behind.
Hey guys.
Hey.
Hi Gabriel.
I think it's just the three of us, right?
Yep.
Okay, well, let's get started. Gabriel, I don't know whether you wanted, I don't remember who was the chairman or the chair before.
Well,
back in the day.
yeah. Yvonne was, I believe, kind of a de facto, but there was a point in which he stepped back and asked for some help and semi-transferred that to me, but everything has been very loose in this working group.
Well, if you would like to chair, go ahead. Otherwise, I'm happy to do so.
I am fine with it. I can keep it. Although, why don't I let you lead this meeting because you had thoughts on what we should discuss today?
Yeah. Okay, sounds good. Well, we all know each other, so we can skip over the normal stuff. Would be great to take some notes if anyone's available to do so. I think my main motivation for this, and I'm sorry that I haven't actually added an item to the agenda for it. Well, there's two, right? One is to get any further feedback on the pull request that I've raised, but more importantly, it's to kind of make a plan. I think it would be great to aim to get the GraphQL over HTTP spec included as part of the next release of the GraphQL spec, like tied into the same release cycle, which may mean that we need to, get some work done quite quickly. But I think we're actually pretty close. There are, however, a few things that I wonder whether we do or do not need to cover. So things such as authentication and other topics as well. I guess there's quite a few that could come up. Does anyone have anything else that they would like to talk about today?
No, my real motivation at this point is to bring life back into this spec and to see what it takes to get to an official form.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's mostly what I thought too. You seem to have a plan for and a date for when we could actually go official with this one. Because I don't see many outstanding issues, so that would be great.
Okay, cool. Well, let's dig into. So one of the main things in my pull request is obviously the watershed, which is a new thing. I think everyone's agreed that it's a reasonable thing to add. There is some pushback on whether it should be, default enabled or default, like servers should support it after the watershed, but do clients have to send it, or can they just keep sending the old traditional JSON and accepting JSON? So I think there's a little bit of a question over that. I'm happy with the text as currently written.
As well.
Also, David raised some compelling notes about the security consequences, things like cross-site request forgery and other such things. I would love to just basically say those are outside of the scope of this spec, because those kind of things are well documented elsewhere. You've got, and also it's dependent on how people do things, right? So if they are using JWTs versus if they're using sessions versus some other solution, and so on and so forth. However, it probably would make sense, even if we don't have any normative specifications around that, to have at least some non-normative notes saying, you know, if you are enabling this over get, then you must do this, that, and the other. If you are supporting these particular media types, then you need to be aware of cross-site request forgery, and, you know, here's where you go to look for information on that, maybe. What is your take on that? Do you think that's something that we should actively specify, that we should comment on in a note, or that we should just ignore entirely?
I'm leaning toward ignore entirely, simply because there's nothing related to GraphQL in any of that at all. It's all HTTP. You would do that whether you're serving GraphQL or anything else. And we don't mention all sorts of other things with respect to HTTP. Why that?
Mm-hmm. How do you feel, Benedict?
I think some of the things that David talked about are somewhat specific to what we are doing with the specification. So perhaps we can just identify those places and then go for a note where it's applicable. But in general, I agree with the sentiment that we don't need to repeat and over specify things that are good practice in HTTP plain.
So I wonder whether we should put something in the spec itself that says, you know, this spec acts on top of standard HTTP best practices, which relate to, you know, security like cross-site request forgery, etc. And you should bring your knowledge of those things when you apply this spec. Because I don't think, as you say, Gabriel, I really don't think that we should be specifying deeply how to do security. It just doesn't, it does seem out of scope. But equally, if we don't comment on it and then someone just implements the spec verbatim and is like, oh, no, I've got this cross-site request forgery, that's a bug in, you know, the GraphQL over HTTP spec. I also think that wouldn't be a good look for GraphQL. So I do feel that having some kind of note would be beneficial.
I honestly just, I don't think that is a case that could happen. And specifically, I mean, I don't think if somebody had a cross, any security issue really, that they could point to this spec and say, see, this is a problem with the spec. If they built something exactly to this spec, given that this is clearly, and it's titled over HTTP, if they ignored security because it wasn't mentioned in this spec, if they ignored cookies because we didn't mention it in this spec, it's the same thing. It's not in the scope, and I think I can't see an argument where somebody can point to this spec and say, see, you missed this, so I had a problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think I'm broadly in agreement.
I am in favor of putting a non-normative note that says, you know, something to the effect of following HTTP best practices or something like that.
Well, interestingly, the media types that David raised were the form URL encoded, the multipart, and text plain. And none of those are ones that we like officially support in the spec. So maybe when we say, if you support other media types, then you should also make sure that you're aware of the security repercussions of doing so, and just leave it at that.
That sounds good.
Yeah, I also like the point, the suggestion that David made about having CSRF protection enforced by just forcing the client to send content type. Having that as a should, it doesn't really help interoperability to let clients omit this header. I think that's the thing where, yeah, you will get the error once that you have to send the content type, and then you just do it, and then it works forever. So
Is the content type a should currently? I think I intend for it currently to be a must.
there's the section that says if the client does not supply a content type, the server should reject it.
Oh, you think it must reject it?
That's what David suggested. Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
That would mean that a server that doesn't reject it would not be GraphQL compliant, or GraphQL over HTTP compliant. I'm uncomfortable with that. I think it should be left in the hands of the server developers. We can recommend against it, which we do with the should. I mean, that's the same as like, it's the same as recommending not to do it or to do it, whatever. But if we strictly rule that, that said, if we forbid it currently, we can always lift that forbiddenness later, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a use case where you just send post requests willy-nilly and just see what you get.
Yeah, I'm just thinking in terms of there are a lot of GraphQL servers out there already, and part of the intent of this release is to keep as many of them as possible spec compliant. And if that means that they have special code in there that says, oh, if there's not a content type, then we know it's probably JSON, or like we look at the first character, and if it's a curly brace, we go, oh, it's probably JSON, we'll treat it as JSON. And that's what they've done for a client. Then they've got this legacy client that's doing that, like a command line app or something like that, that can't be easily updated. If they continue to do that, then officially we would be saying that their server is not GraphQL over HTTP compliant, which I don't think is really true. The aim for the GraphQL over HTTP spec is to say, these are the things that the server must do so that the client can talk to it. And likewise, these are the things that the client must do so that it will work with any server. I don't think we really need to instigate to specify too much about the outside of those boundaries. Like if you want to expand your capabilities by, by putting extra, like adding other media types and things like that should be fine.
Yeah.
One note as well. I don't know if this should still be considered our goal, but earlier this group had the goal not to create a first version of this spec to be strict and forceful, but to create a loose spec so that existing implementations could feel comfortable with what we have and the knowledge that we are going to become more strict in the future. And I think maybe that is an area where we could allow that. We could say in the watershed even that we will start becoming more strict in this area.
Mm-hmm.
I think the specific thing, it's not something that would prevent servers from working, but it's also something where if a server implementation decides to disregard that part of the spec, that also doesn't prevent it from working. They can just say, oh, that part of the spec we don't comply with, but our server is still fine for basically all use cases.
Isn't that really what the intent of a should is, though? Like, you should do this, but if you don't, that's fine, you're still compliant.
And I would lean toward making them compliant if it works.
Right. How about we add a note then, explaining why they should do that?
Yeah.
I think it's generally a good idea to explain statements made in the spec. Of course, it's
I agree.
because I mean, we put a lot of thought into if a specific sentence should say should or must, but then when you read it, I think an explanation really helps you understand why it's the case and why it's important for you to follow the spec in that case.
Yeah,
I
I mean, to
agree,
be
and I
honest,
think-
it's helpful for us, like comments in the code later, right?
Yeah.
And I think that should be good practice for any time we have a should.
Yeah, agreed. Sorry about all the tapping. Okay, great. So let's assume that we've made a few little changes based on this, and we merge this specification pull request. What do you see as any outstanding actions? I think we might need to put a couple of notes in there based on David's feedback. Other than that, is there much else? What do we need to do before we present this to the working group and say, here's our first draft?
I think we need to clarify whether we still are in preliminary or draft stage.
I think.
Go ahead.
Go on.
I was saying that the only reason is that when we originally spelled out those stages, our goal was to move quickly, and we just didn't. And so I think if we're going to move forward, perhaps we should define what it takes to become draft stage or even further, so that and maybe that doesn't happen until the GraphQL working group meeting, so that we could be clear on what they want. But yeah, I think it's just clear now that we need to know what a solid first release of this looks like or requires.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. I think, as you hinted at, it might be a case of it is preliminary until we present it to the working group, at which point we raise it to draft status. And I think that should probably be done. Like, our job in this sub-working group, right, is to figure out what the solution to this should probably look like. It is not to actually put this final rubber stamp on it. The final rubber stamp comes down to the main working group. We're just a subcommittee, effectively. So I think that should also potentially be true for the like the draft status and things like that as well. So yeah, I suggest we get it in as good a shape as we feel that we can, and then we present it to the working group with the aim of people at the working group reading it, and by the next working group deciding that we can advance it or that we can't advance it, etc.
That sounds
Does that
good.
seem reasonable? Yeah, cool.
Yep, agreed.
Okay, great. Well, I will take the initiative on doing a few minor edits to this. I think we're due to merge it in like 4 days anyway, so I might just let it go ahead with the merge, and then, well, I might do a few minor edits that I don't think will concretely change things, you know, adding non-normative notes and stuff like that, get it merged. And then I think either me or David raise a few improvements with regard to like some simple comments. Like we agreed just now, I don't think it needs to go into great detail on security, and not even necessarily even mention topics like cross-site request forgery, because when you start listing those things, there's all the things that you haven't listed, right? So I think more in terms of like, there are security repercussions of doing that. They are standard HTTP security repercussions. You should make sure you're familiar with those, kind of thing, that kind of note. There is another big question, which is, one of our aims with this was to build a structure for the specification to help us as we go forwards, right? At some point, we're going to be adding potentially WebSockets, or that will be a side one. Also, same for server-sent events. Maybe that's a chapter, a section, sorry, or maybe it is like an additional spec. It's not immediately clear to me what those things are. But one of the comments that came out of this rewrite is we've talked about the request and the response, but should we instead have been talking about the client and the server?
I think there's room for both. In both cases, the client and server each have roles for request, client making the request, the server receiving the request, and the inverse for the response. The server has to send the response, but the client has to read it.
Yeah. I started rewriting it in terms of client and server, and honestly, I just started having the exact same problems the other way around, just as you've suggested. Neither way wins.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's
so I'm trying
definitely
to think,
not in the scope of this PR.
Indeed. So I think merging this as is, and then if we need to restructure it, that's fine. But at least we have the shoulds and the musts in the right thing.
I didn't find any ambiguity with regards to having those two terms sometimes intermixed or used in different places. So while reading the spec, I was never confused by that. So for me,
yeah, that's good. And you know, I do try and avoid ambiguity where I can. My issue is more like someone might come on and they want to implement the client. So therefore, maybe they should only need to read the client section, or the server section's there for additional information kind of thing, which may be beneficial. But also, if we're talking in terms of like request and response, what does that mean when it comes to subscriptions or, you know, live queries or things like that in future? What does it mean for stream and defer? Stream and defer, because it's the response is now a stream, right? It's now server-sent events, I guess, is quite common for it, or there's a bunch of different approaches you can use, I suppose. Is request and response the right shape to be ready for those future things?
Yeah, maybe too limiting, definitely.
And would changing it to client and server fix that? Because I mean, to me, it feels like subscriptions, at least like WebSockets, server-sent events, sorry, not subscriptions, to be clear, WebSockets and server-sent events, they feel like they should be separate sections, like full top-level sections, because they're very different, right? Maybe even separate specifications. We're talking here about the traditional HTTP request response cycle. WebSockets is very clearly something different from that. Server-sent events is actually much more similar to a request response shape. But like figuring out what we intend to do when we get there should influence how we structure the spec now, I think. But it's not
separating out subscriptions wouldn't really work, or would at least lead to a bunch of duplication, because to initiate the subscription, you do need to have some of the same kinds of communication going on that you already have in the standard query mutation model. And then there's a bunch of negotiation going on to switch it over to a subscription, but it's initiated the same, and then I think we can reuse a couple of parts.
I think certainly the media type stuff is in common, but the payload for a WebSocket connection, for example, is like even the handshake for a WebSocket connection is quite different. So I don't know, maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. Because we do talk about it in quite abstract ways. I mean, we don't We don't give much in the way of examples with like HTTP headers in place, do we? Like we hint at some. Obviously content type and accept, but we don't give full request examples. So yeah, maybe these would work.
I'm trying to think
over
of this
WebSockets.
in the same way that I think of code. If I'm writing a feature for say an MVP or V1 of a product, and I know that future versions are going to contain certain things, the only thing I'm concerned with right now is I'm not going to want to have breaking changes at the time of that new feature. So if I'm thinking of that with respect to this spec, I'm going to think, I don't want to force a server implementation or client, I guess, either one, to have to go back and re-implement things to be compliant once our spec starts talking about WebSockets or server sent events, even though they're not implementing them. So as long as we make it clear that the things mentioned in this spec do not relate to those things, but when we do add those things to the spec, nothing that's in here so far will change, to a degree that will break you.
So you're saying allow for the structure to change, but obviously the meaning should not. Has that captured your intent?
By structure, you mean of the document?
Yes, the document structure, yeah.
Yes, to allow for additional sections without changing anything meaningful in what's existing today.
So maintaining the current structure, maintaining the current specification wording, like in terms of musts and shoulds, but also keeping them in the same sections where possible, so that it doesn't really affect people that aren't implementing WebSockets.
I'm not sure it matters where things exist, as long as a implementation that is compliant today, who does not implement WebSockets or server sent events, will still be compliant once the spec contains information on those things.
Yes, I think we all agree on that point. We certainly shouldn't break any existing clients when we introduce WebSockets as an optional feature, server sent events as an optional feature.
And I honestly,
Agreed.
I think that's our only concern at this point with respect to those things. As long as what we have written today will not change compliance when we do add those things. Like, I mean, if we start to consider those things and say, in order to make those work, this must be true in the request or in the response. As long as we're not going to require those without those things being implemented, then we're fine. But if there is anything that must change in this spec just to mention those things, then we should make sure we do that now rather than later.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I agree. The main reason that I bring this up is the roadmap document that we created all those years ago said explicitly in it that one of the aims of version 1 spec was in layout and structure, version 1 should lay a foundation for future development and standardization. Okay. So putting the spec in the right structure. Now, I'm okay to actually just sidestep that and say, well, we think it's in a good structure, but if it turns out when we write the WebSocket stuff that we have to restructure it, then so be it, so long as the rules themselves don't change. So that someone that's already compliant remains compliant. I'm happy with that if need be. But if we can guess at what the structure should be later and then put it into that structure, that would be preferable. But it's not clear to me what that is.
I don't think that would take too much effort, as long as we have, I mean, if you're thinking about the structure of the document as sections, headings, etc., then if we can imagine adding something like WebSockets or server sent events as you said earlier, as new sections, imagine we added those today. If there were new sections, if they were included in this doc and not in a separate spec, how would we include those? Because if we were to include those, chances are there's other things that will be included in the same way. And if we can imagine that and structure what we do have in the same way, for example, if we wrote it like this and then added this new section, it might look shoehorned in. Oh yeah, now we have this other section. Well, maybe we should have added a heading in the beginning of this thing, knowing that there's going to be another heading of equal weight down the line. And if we just do that, then I think we covered that.
Yeah, I think that seems reasonable.
Yeah, I think the current headings might not work when we introduce some additional features. For example, the heading serialization format or the heading request, those would have different meaning when seen in the context of server-side events, for example.
Yeah, I'm thinking similarly.
And that kind of brings me back to the heading of a certain weight. If we were to add a parent to this entire thing that I'm not sure of what the title would be, but if everything that exists currently is under a certain heading that somehow differentiates it from things like WebSockets and other what are they, protocols, then I think that stuff is fine, because if you have serialization as a first level heading, then it applies everywhere in the spec. But if you have it as a second level heading under, the only one first level heading in the document right now, that allows for a first level heading somewhere else where they can have their own serialization, etc. And it's isolated from this whole thing, but what we have right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. Interestingly, serialization, I think, is one of the things that would actually be common. So like the media types, I think, makes sense to be its own chapter. And originally, I actually had quite a lot of the rules were in the media types chapter to start with. And then I sort of moved them out into the request and response where it seemed to make more sense. But then when we start thinking in terms of there being, standard HTTP request and response, and then there being WebSocket request and response, and there being server-sent events request and response, all three of those are going to use the same like serialization, most likely. The regular HTTP isn't going to support subscriptions. It's not going to support stream and defer.
I'm having a really hard time trying to come up with a term that describes the thing that we currently have.
Yeah, me too.
Or just request.
It's get and post requests, I was thinking, but actually that's not it either, because server sent events, I think you can do over get or post probably. So, I mean, yeah,
I think there's two issues with respect to formatting. One is what we were just discussing here as far as a main header for all of this. But the second is how and if we create a section for things that apply to everything. If you say serialization will apply regardless, then that should not be under whatever header we are creating right now. It should be in a common section, but we have to make sure that it will be common in the future. Otherwise, we're breaking compliance.
Yeah, I agree. But I wonder whether actually the concept of request and response is actually correct as it is currently specified, potentially. And then there might be another chapter that is more like stream. So there's a request, and then there's a singular response, which works for what we have. And then there might also be a stream response, which would apply for subscriptions and for stream and defer. Sorry, stream was a bad choice of word for it because of stream and defer. But, you know, like a series of responses. That might be it. Because when you have server-sent events, right, you still send a request that is in basically the same shape. It's just you're using the server-sent events like request headers, and you're sending the server-sent events response headers as well. But the actual response payloads are the same as they would have been over a traditional HTTP request, except in the event of obviously a stream or a subscription, in which case you'll get a series of them. But they're still the same structure. They still follow the same rules. They're still the same serialization. So it might be that actually request and response is correct. And what we end up doing when we add server-sent events is actually we remove some of the like things that talk specifically about headers, for example, and we then put them into, like, we add a new chapter section, sorry, that is, you know, traditional HTTP requests, and then server-sent events, and then WebSockets that then have their own special, here's how we do headers, here's how we do this, that, and the other. I mean, WebSockets, for example, is quite interesting because though you can send headers with a WebSocket request, you can't often do that from web browsers. Web browsers are quite restricted in what they can do with WebSockets, whereas from other clients like command line clients, they can do more. So typically what you have to do with a WebSocket connection is you have this like initial payload, which serves the same purpose as a header, but has its own, you know, completely different security rules, because a user can send whatever they want in an initial payload. So, I mean, I'm going into more details here, but the point is the payloads in it after that point would still be the same, but the way of specifying that, you know, it is JSON content type may well be different. So that's fun.
Yeah.
But maybe what I'm saying is maybe request and response is actually the correct thing, and maybe we should stick with what we've got.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. And I also think that the more we discuss this, the more it becomes clear that there's a lot of things with respect to WebSockets and server-sent events and whatever else that we would not know whether the spec as written today works with those things without a lot of thought and discussion, more than we're willing to do right now.
Let's invite Dennis. Dennis has written the spec for the new WebSocket protocol for GraphQL, and also I think the spec for the server-sent events. So if we can raise this with Dennis, we can ask him to review what we've got and ask him whether there's likely to be any issues with adding those specs to it in future.
But I think you brought up a good point about let's go back to the example of serialization. Even if we keep it as a top level heading right now, once we add further top level headings, which may have different opinions about how serialization must be done, or perhaps just certain aspects of serialization, you can always move those things down into the top level headings, which then have their own section which further details how serialization is supposed to work. That's not breaking the spec, it's just moving things somewhere else. So it won't be as stable in terms of things are written under this heading in this line, but semantically it will still be the same.
Yeah, I think that's good to keep in mind in general, but also with specmd, it's pretty handy in how it generates like the fixed URLs for headers. So long as you keep consistent headers, the specmd links will be the same. So you can have kind of the same link carry across multiple versions of the spec, hopefully. if we start moving things around, putting them under different headers or at least different tiers of header, then the links will change and we'll get broken links. It's not the end of the world. Like the user clicks it, it doesn't go anywhere. It just sends them to the top of the spec and then they have to find the place again. But if we can maintain those permalinks, that would be better.
Agreed.
Okay, cool. I have added an action. I'm going to task that to myself. So I'm going to reach out to Dennis and have him read over this. We'll get this merged. I will also make the changes that we discussed, at least the ones that are mentioned in the thread itself. If there's anything else you think should be in there, comment on the pull request, because I'm not sure if we have full notes in the notes from this call. Yeah, okay. And then from there, we should at least get David's feedback. I might have a go and see if I can write a few notes that would make David happy. In fact, I'll add that as an action as well. Cool. I'll have a go at doing that as well. And then if we can get enough confidence, then maybe we should raise it at the next working group. And by next, I don't mean this coming one. I mean the one in August. So with an aim to raise this at the August working group. How does that sound?
To raise what? Sorry.
To raise the merged version of the GraphQL over HTTP spec at the August GraphQL specification working group, the top level working group.
Sounds
So
good
what-
to me.
What then would be discussed at the July working group?
The GraphQL spec working group, the main one.
Yeah.
I wasn't planning to raise anything there, though I might just comment that we are getting closer.
Okay. Yeah, I thought I saw something. Yeah, just a small update you had, but I didn't know exactly what your thoughts were as what would be brought up there. Would we share the spec? Would we just discuss the idea of a watershed, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, good. Good question. Yeah, I was just basically planning to give a status update. We commented on this at the main working group recently, that the subcommittees do things, but they haven't really been told how to then bring that information back. And so either lots of stuff goes on and the main working group just doesn't know about it, or things are not going on and the main working group doesn't know about that either. So I'm going to try and make a point of reporting back from this working group, at least, from time to time, small updates. And I'd like to encourage the other subcommittees to do so as well. So I'm kind of trying to model that a little bit. But yeah, basically, I just wanted to give them an update, say, we've got it, we've kickstarted it, got it working again. Here's our current status. And if our plan at the end of this meeting is to say, we want to present this at the next working group, I will tell them at this coming working group, we're intending to present it next working group. So give us a week or two to get the final edits in, but then give it a good read before the next working group, because it would be great to get your feedback at that point.
I think that sounds great.
Fantastic. All right, I should write that down.
One thing that I think we could do until next time is go through the existing issues. And I see that we have 2 milestones in the project. One being post 1.0 release and one being the 1.0 release milestone. And yeah, and one is September 2020, which I don't think anyone cares about anymore.
Yeah.
So I think it would be a good idea to go through the issues and assign them to the proper milestones. Perhaps close them, because I think one or two of them might be in the spec already and just haven't been closed. Then see which ones are still left.
That's a good point. I think that we should have, before we present at the August main working group meeting, we should have our issues under control. Just, you know, like a professional air to this group. Benji, I can't hear you.
I'm muted. Another comment on, yeah, I agree. Another comment in terms of structure is we wanted to adopt specmd, which I believe we have done. We are using specmd syntax in various places.
Yeah,
so I will, once this is merged, I'll task myself on making sure that we have that up and running smoothly, unless you already know that it's doing.
That would be one issue that can be closed down.
Exactly, yeah, that's the top one I noticed. But also, if you look at the main GraphQL specification, the different sections are in different files. So I think as part of as doing that issue number 8 specmd, I think I'll split up the document into those the current sections, the ones that we currently have. So I'll give them actual, you know, section numbers, just like we do for the main GraphQL specification, unless anyone has any hesitations with doing that.
Nope.
Is the spec that large? Is it necessary?
It's not particularly large, but we are using sections. And since that's how the GraphQL spec works, I figure it makes sense to just copy the same pattern. Like one of our sections, I mean, if you look at the GraphQL spec, the introduction section is like, I don't know, 30 lines of markdown, that's it in that file. And ours will be similar, like the content type section is, again, small. It's just in terms of being consistent. As we extend it over time, having it in separate sections may make it easier to edit as well. But mostly just in terms of consistency with the spec itself.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not against it. So who can actually go through the issues and close them or
I can do
assign
that.
them to milestones? Because I don't have permissions.
I can take that on.
Okay. Should we? So are the, I guess the September 22 milestone is something we can definitely close, but are there any other milestones we might add, or perhaps any labels we might add to organize the issues? Something that you can think of?
I like the 2 milestones other than September 2020. Obviously, I like the other 2 milestones. Is basically very clear, like this is the stuff we need to get done before we release, and this is the other stuff. So I think whilst you're going through them, Gabriel, if you can make sure that everything is in the right milestone according to what our intent is now, which may be different from our intent like 2 years ago. That would be good. But I don't think we need any more milestones for now. I think we should just aim to get that version 1 release milestone complete, hopefully by the August GraphQL spec working group.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. And I think that the thing with milestones is that that's easily changed as we're moving forward. The post 1.0 release could become multiple milestones in the future.
Agreed.
Excuse me. Perhaps we, in terms of labels, perhaps we could lend some from the GraphQL spec repo. They do have this process of strawman, draft, accepted, and so on. Also this label about process. So I think it would be good to at least differentiate between things that are kind of meta and concerning the process and things that actually concern the contents of the spec.
I agree. Are you able to copy those across, Gabriel?
I don't know if I can copy them, but recreating them is not that difficult.
Okay. Ideally, if they can be identical, then the links will be basically the same. Like issue templates will work the same, things like that. We'll be able to share them between the two things, and that can be problematic with emojis if they're not exact copies.
Yeah.
So if you have any issues with that, just ping me and I'll take over that task if you need me to.
Okay.
I'm going to task it to you though.
Sounds good.
Thanks. Cool. Is there anything else that we should discuss? Any other actions that we should write down that aren't in this document?
Not that I can think of.
No, I got nothing more.
Fantastic. Well, in which case I shan't keep you fine people any longer. And I look forward to talking to you again. Should we do the next one on the same schedule? Like this same, whatever it is, Monday? I guess we need to find one that David can attend, really. That David and Dennis, if we can get them both to attend one, that would be ideal.
Agreed. And I don't know that it matters for any of us three so far, whether we're on the same schedule right now or not. So we can make this ad hoc like we did this time.
Okay, let's go ad hoc. I'll see if I can find a time that works for both David and Dennis, and then we'll go from there.
Sounds good.
Okay, I'll action myself on scheduling the next meeting as well then.
Yeah.
All right, fantastic.
I'll definitely try to be there, but I don't think I have something particularly important to contribute apart from my feedback. So
well, it's always recorded and put on YouTube anyway, and asynchronous feedback's always valuable too. Sometimes more valuable because you can go back and reread it. So yeah, fantastic. Well, if we can make it so we can all attend, I'll try that. But otherwise, yeah, it would be good to get another meeting in, maybe quite soon, actually, like sort of 2 to 3 weeks time. Yeah, so that we can get as much done as possible before the August working group.
Agreed. I think that it also helps to have a meeting shortly after the July working group meetings so that we can attack any action items or feedback we get there. Yeah.
Excellent. Agreed. Okay. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Thanks for setting this up.
You too. Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.